So today we're going to talk about one of the deepest and most profound teachings of early Buddhism, clinging to views and opinions. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm the study director at the Secular Buddhist Association, that's secularbuddhism.org. And today we're going to talk a bit about clinging to views and opinions in early Buddhism. This is one of the most, I think, deep and profound teachings we can find in Buddhism, and a lot is made of it throughout the history of Buddhism as a religion and as a philosophy as well. So I think the point of our work here in Doug's Secular Dharma is to help promote wisdom and kindness towards others, as well as trying to reduce stress in daily life. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to become aware of this teaching from early Buddhism about the problems of clinging to views and opinions, and how to understand that within the context of early Buddhism. Probably the two most famous texts we find this teaching in are the Atthakavagga, which is probably one of the earliest texts within the Buddhist canon. It's part of the Sutta Nipata, and it's a collection basically of verse poems. Another place that is very, very famous where we find this, perhaps in a somewhat more mature elaboration, is in the Watersnake Suta, the Alagadupama Sutta, as it's called. And it's the Watersnake Suta that has the most famous parable where the Buddha talks about the Dhamma or the Dharma as being a raft. He says it's like a raft that we use to cross a wide river. And just as the wise person will use the raft to cross the river, but when they're on the other side, they don't then carry the raft around with them. There's no point to that. The point is that once you've used the raft for its purpose, you leave it aside and then you go on your way. And in this parable, the other shore is awakening or nibbana. And so the idea is that you use the Dhamma for the purpose of attaining this end, but then one does not cling to it afterwards. And in fact, I think within the context of early Buddhism, the whole point is that if you're clinging to anything, including the Dhamma itself, you're not going to be able to actually achieve the farther shore. Nevertheless, this sutta, as well as all the various different prose poems within the Atthakavagga, have to be understood within a context where the Buddha is actually proposing a whole number of very substantive, positive claims. So in the Atthakavagga, he's making a number of claims about, for instance, how it is that disputes arise. That, for instance, disputes among people arise because people cling to particular ideas. People they find certain kinds of states of mind and body pleasurable. They cling to those states, and as a result, they end up in disputes with other people. The Watersnake Suta begins with the Buddha criticizing a young monk who has misunderstood the Dharma. As we know, monks at that time and still are, within the Theravāda tradition at least, celibate. And this was a monk who believed that he did not need to pursue celibacy. And the Buddha was very adamant that that was an example of wrong view, that this particular monk had misunderstood the Dhamma. The important thing here is then to reconcile these two aspects of the teaching. On the one hand, we have certain parts of the teaching that clearly are true and false, that the Buddha has no problem saying this is the way things are. And on the other hand, the Buddha is saying we shouldn't cling to views and opinions. There's one standard interpretation of these suttas that basically the Buddha is propounding no views, that one should not have any views at all, that any view or any belief that we hold is to that extent problematic. And while there are indeed some passages within these suttas that seem to be read that way, I don't think that you can read the Nikayas that way throughout consistently. The Buddha clearly believes that there are certain views that are right view, that are wholesome and healthy to hold. So we have to figure out how to reconcile these. In fact, the Watersnake Suta is called that because there's a very famous parable of a water snake that the Buddha talks about within the sutta. And what he says is that the Dharma is like a snake. If you grasp it the right way, then it won't bite you. But if you grasp it the wrong way, let's say by the end of the tail, it can swing around and bite you. Which is to say that there's correct ways of interpreting the Dhamma and incorrect ways of interpreting the Dhamma. And in particular, within the context of that sutta, the Buddha does talk about one incorrect way to interpret the Dhamma, and that is to use it as method of dispute and argument with other people, to try to win arguments, to try to make particular kinds of, we could say, purely philosophical points in order to shoot a dart at somebody else. And that, for the Buddha, is the incorrect way to use the Dhamma, because then it becomes an object of clinging. Later on in the sutta, the Buddha does talk about his own role as a teacher. And in particular, he talks about people from other belief systems who misinterpret the Dhamma or who slander him in various ways, claim that he has views that he doesn't have. And the Buddha, of course, doesn't like that. He says that he argues against such people and tries to make clear what his own views are. On the other hand, the Buddha also says, I think very, very importantly, critically really, that no matter what other people say about him, he doesn't take it personally. If people criticize him, he doesn't get upset about it. And if people praise him, he doesn't get full of himself about it. And this, I think, is the real heart of not clinging to views. The point about not clinging to views and opinions is not that we don't have views and opinions. It's rather that we don't cling to them. We don't identify with them. We don't think of them as mine. Because in clinging to them and in thinking of them as part of ourselves, as who we are, we put ourselves into a position where when those views are criticized, we take it personally. On the other hand, if we think of views almost like parts of the furniture of the world, as things that aren't ours, as things are just the way they are, then if someone criticizes them, it is as though they criticized a table or a chair. It has nothing to do with me, it's not I, it's not mine, it's not myself. Holding to views in this way, that is to say, holding them without clinging to them, we can bring ourselves to a place where we are of right view, we have certain right views, but we don't identify with them. And by not identifying with them, we also don't use them as the raw material for disputes with other people. We may state that this is the view that we think is correct. We may state that the view that somebody else holds is not correct. In the final analysis, if we don't hold to them personally, if we don't take it personally what our views are or what somebody else's views are, we put ourselves into a position where we're much less stressed by opposing views that other people hold. And we're much more prone to be kind to people who hold other views. And I absolutely understand this is very difficult. It's certainly difficult for me, particularly when views that other people hold can be damaging. Can be damaging to the unfortunate around us. It can be damaging to the environment. It can be damaging to the world. It can be very difficult in that sort of situation to be able to come at a view in a sort of an objective way without personalizing it. Nevertheless, I think that's the strategy that the Buddha wants us to hold. And it's a very wise kind of approach as well, because it's true that I am not my views, that you are not your views. If you think about your own past, you'll realize that there was a time before you held these views, when maybe you even held the exact opposite view. I know that there was a time when I was much younger when I held very, very different views about any number of things. I don't think there's practically a single view that I hold now of any consequence that I've held for literally my entire life, at least as far as I can remember back. So in that sense, I am not my views. Also, it's true that I'm not my views in the sense that I'm not really in control of my views. Views are things that arise within us. Opinions arise within us. Although it's sometimes said within certain theological contexts that we can change our opinions almost at will. I think that if you look into your own self, you'll realize, or your own past, your own mind, you'll realize that that's not true. The views that you hold, the opinions that you hold, are things that arise as part of the furniture of the mind. And while we can certainly aim to put ourselves into positions where these opinions may change in time, indeed that's really part of the point of practice. Nevertheless, that kind of aim takes an enormous amount of time and effort, and it's not the kind of thing that we can do by like switching on a light switch. So I hope that you've seen now that the Buddha's teaching on non-clinging to views and opinions can help us increase the wisdom with which we approach other people in the world and ourselves. It can increase the amount of kindness that we can hold towards other people with different views, difficult though that may be, and it can help us to have a less stress-filled life, because if we are willing to hold our own views and the views of others, as it were, with an open hand, without clinging to them, then we can become less stressed over how people approach the world. This is, as I say, I think one of the deepest and most profound teachings of early Buddhism. It's also one of the most difficult, both to understand, because I think it's subtle in various ways, and to put into practice. Because I think for all of us, views and opinions are some of the things that we hold closest to ourselves, and some of the things that we identify with the most, particularly, let's say, political or social views, and being told to let those go or to hold them with a more open hand, to not identify with them, can be extremely difficult. But I think it's work that it would really help us to undertake. And if you find these kinds of teachings useful, if you find that they help increase wisdom, increase kindness, and decrease stress in the world, that you'll consider subscribing to Doug's Secular Dharma. We'll be discussing aspects like these of early Buddhism, secularism, and so on, with one of these coming out roughly once a week on Mondays. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. And if you've come back many times, then I'm really glad also to see you here. Please do put your questions and comments down below, any that you have. I love to read what you guys have to say. And I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks very much.